What if I said everything you know about the history and origins of mixed martial arts is actually missing a massive part of the story? While the Gracies and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came to the forefront at UFC 1, they couldn't have gotten there without the influence of another martial art, and in fact, it's the entire reason that maybe BJJ even exists. But what if I then also told you that collegiate wrestling, sambo, and even pro wrestling could all trace their lineage back to the exact same place? And it was a place that has given birth to one of the most important gyms in martial arts history, a gym known only as the Snake Pit.
Some of these guys would bite each other's noses off. I don't know if penicillin heals that.
They were pretty gruesome, from my understanding. Lots of blood in these matches, teeth get knocked out, knees blown out, shoulders.
The biggest celebrities in our society back in those days, there was no team sports, there was no baseball, there was no NBA, there was no NFL.
So I spoke to the experts and found the people who are still carrying that lineage today to bring you the legendary story of how combat sports as we know it were forever changed into what we see in mixed martial arts today. I'm Balian from MMA On Point, and this is the story of Catch as Catch Can Wrestling. Chapter 1, The Origins of Catch. I think it goes without saying that most of you watching this video know that wrestling has been around for pretty much forever. But how did we go from that to singlets, submissions, or even SummerSlams? And how does any of that affect mixed martial arts? Well, to unravel this MMA origin story, you've got to start at its roots, and that begins in the medieval ages in England, where as a peasant or a working man, there wasn't much to do across the country, but various games and events were still being held at festivals and fairs. And no matter where you were in England, wrestling was a part of it. Whether you were in Cornwall, Lancashire, Yorkshire, each section of the country had its own unique style of folk wrestling that was watched and enjoyed by the British public. But out of all the wrestling styles going on across England, Lancashire folk wrestling started to emerge as an entirely unique style of its own. Now, it was different from all the other styles in England because they would follow each other to the ground and work for submissions and pins. Before that, the objective in other English folk styles was simply, take the guy down. It was all very basic in comparison to what these guys were now doing. Now, this sowed the seeds for the start of a wrestling movement that would shape the future of sport. This art became known as Lancashire up and down fighting, or often known by another name, purring. Now, that might sound like an adorable noise that a cat makes, but it actually involved grappling on the feet whilst wearing metal-toed boots and kicking each other in the shins. Then the fights would continue to the floor where submissions were allowed, but also throttling, which is basically, just choking someone with both your hands. A winner would be declared by submission, or if the other man was deemed unable to continue. Sound familiar?
Where anything can happen, and probably will.
But also, more often than not, these pairing matches would result in death. Not that surprising, really. In fact, so many people died while doing Lancashire up and down fighting that in 1820, the sport was made illegal. So something had to change, and out of that was born a formalized and competitive version of wrestling known as Catch as Catch Can. An early yet complex system of grappling that would go on to change martial arts forever. Chapter 2, Catch as Catch Can Wrestling.
It was called Catch as Catch Can. I think it would call that because you used to grab a fella wherever you could.
And that's why it's Catch as Catch Can. I'm working 2 moves ahead. It's like a game of chess.
And they started practicing and training moves that you will still see in MMA today. And then it was right around the 1850s and 60s that the rules became more solidified. They banned the things like throttling, kicking, headbutting that had been allowed in up and down fighting. But the one thing that truly made Lancashire catch wrestling unique is that the fighters continued to once again fight when it hit the ground. The sport was growing in popularity, but also in the late 1800s, you would see catch wrestling at the local carnival shows. And it's pretty much what you can imagine, really. Locals could win money if they could pin or submit the catch wrestler. Submissions were obviously favoured because then they couldn't dispute a win. If you were the catch wrestler at the carnivals, obviously submitting someone as quickly as possible was important. And then when it came to professional catch wrestling, there were no points either. You could only win by pin or submission. And now catch wrestling was on the road. It wasn't long before it came to America, where again it began circling the continent at carnivals and fairs.
Usually they tried to find like the blacksmith or somebody like that,
Who would wrestle
biggest, burliest guy in town to wrestle it.
The traveling circuses, the carnivals, all these sorts of things, were a big thing.
But even though it was a professional sport now, the art of catch-as-catch-can wrestling was still a form of combat and used in completely unsanctioned situations.
Some of these guys would bite each other's noses off. I don't know if penicillin heals that, or a bitten off ear or a bitten cheek. A broken finger, thumbs in the eyes, fish hooking.
They were pretty gruesome. Lots of blood in these matches, teeth getting knocked out, knees blown out, shoulders. There was not a part of their body that did not go through the wear and tear.
Meanwhile, back in the UK, while all of that's going on, in 1899, the first major tournament is held in London, which is literally, the capital of the British Empire, so it's a massive deal. And then in 1904, when the Olympics came to the USA, that year it was held under catch-as-catch-can rules, simply because of how popular the sport had grown. Now, these Olympics are really a significant turning point in the history of all wrestling styles. Before this, Olympic wrestling was done exclusively under Greco-Roman rules. Now, in the 1904 Olympics, it was called catch wrestling, but they had applied limitations to prevent submissions of any kind from being used. Now, this was done just to protect the athletes because they just saw them as, too dangerous. And so, right up until this point, submissions had always been a really integral part of what catch wrestling was. So yeah, it was only then after the 1904 Olympics that we start to see these two branching paths and the different forms that wrestling will go on to take. Now that obviously just blew a historical bubble for you, but it goes a step even further. It also happened that the United States Amateur Athletic Union, or the AAU, used the Olympics to also hold their tournament for the official World Catch Wrestling Championships in America, meaning these rules effectively became codified into the tournament system. So the winner of the Olympics wasn't just a gold medalist, but also the US champion. The significance of this is the birth of American freestyle wrestling. So in America going forward, it was catch wrestling pretty much only in name because they didn't have any submissions. It wasn't until 1922 that they actually changed the name though to freestyle wrestling. But of course, there's something else to consider here. Because of this significant rule change, submissions and catch wrestling itself just kind of took a turn. Those carnivals we mentioned earlier kept churning out major attractions with catch wrestling matches, and so as freestyle wrestling developed, catch wrestling also began to develop its own stage in America. Now at those carnival shows, yeah, a lot of those matches were fixed, but then they also had the pro catch wrestling champions competing there as well. Either way, this kind of created an ambiguity on the catch wrestling circuit between, those that used submissions and those that didn't, and those that did became superstars.
Back in those days, there was no team sports. There was no baseball. There was no NBA. There was no NFL. The biggest celebrities in our society were the world champion in boxing and the world champion in catch-as-catch-can wrestling.
At this time, you had guys in America like Frank Gotch who were dominating the catch wrestling sporting scene.
The arguments about Frank Gotch being one of the greatest wrestlers to ever live are totally valid. Ultimately, the body of his work and what he brought to just the consciousness of combat sports at the time and wrestling cannot be replaced.
Frank was one of the biggest US catch wrestling stars, a multiple-time champion.
It started back there with Frank Gotch and Farmer Burns and these guys that were traveling around and creating these big grappling matches and creating world championships and catch-as-catch-can. It morphed into what we know now as pro wrestling.
After Gotch retired, three men who would become known as the Gold Dust Trio would form their own catch wrestling promotion, but modified the rules and the product to attract fans. Now this led to scripting matches for more exciting outcomes and adding moves that weren't real but could fool an audience. Slowly though, that same audience started to catch on, and this was part of the reason that in 1922 the AAU changed the name of their rule set to something different: freestyle wrestling. So the 1904 Olympics completely changed the wrestling world and divided it into several different sports. It was only 1896 that they brought back the Olympics, and that was the first one since ancient times. And they had decided to not allow professionals to compete. Kind of strange, you might think, but it was in order to make the games fair to people who didn't make a living from the sport they competed in. So when wrestling comes to the 1904 Olympics, only amateurs are allowed. That's why guys like Gotch didn't compete. But this single choice by the Olympic Committee would have massive consequences for the future of grappling. Back in the UK after the Olympics, the National Amateur Wrestling Association was formed for wrestlers that wanted to compete in the next Olympic Games. That meant across the next 20 years, the amateurs developed and were focusing on pure sport and technique, ironically meaning they started to become the best in the world, where professional wrestling slowly became a spectacle to sell tickets to an audience.
Lewis the winner. Chickard gets up there, somebody's raising Lewis's hand.
But these pro wrestling shows actually got so popular, in fact, that there weren't enough actual skilled wrestlers around. So they had to lean more into the violence, with weapons being used, women's mud wrestling. It got so insane that by the 1930s, the London City Council banned professional wrestling.
You won't be able to tell one from the other in a few moments. Both men are born mud-eaters. The referee is only learning.
Seriously killing the sport. But in the north of England, where catch wrestling had been born, these pro wrestling shows were not as popular. Writers Swain and Harvey wrote pro wrestling was a failure in Wigan because the miners were so rough they couldn't be impressed. So, kind of the opposite happened. In this part of the country, Catch as Catch Can only continued to develop, and out of its darkest corners started to emerge truly revolutionary figures who brought their art to a world stage and were ready to take over. Chapter 3: The Snake Pit. Wigan is a small town in England. It's now a bit more famous in the MMA world for helping produce Tom Aspinall, the interim heavyweight champion. But back in 1930, it was mostly just your standard English town in the heart of Lancashire, the origin of catch wrestling. But in that year, the Wrestling and Boxing Comrades Association was founded by T. McCarthy, Joe Carroll, who won the British Open in London I mentioned earlier, and another man whose name would become complete legend, Billy Riley. He was known as a deadly submission artist, and early on, apparently, he was notorious for breaking people's arms, and Billy himself had been British Empire champion after winning the title against Jack Robinson in Africa. At this time, in Wigan and the surrounding areas of Lancashire, they were mostly known for their mining industry, and all across the region, these miners played a key role in shaping the future of the sport.
We feel like a kind of an elite of the wrestling world. That's what we feel, don't we?
Oh, that's right.
No, we were.
We're like the fantastic.
We were the elite of the wrestling world.
From the Lancashire pits emerged this group of individuals who fell in love with wrestling. They did it for fun, to settle disputes or to train to be ready to compete at a now professional level. I asked Tom Aspinall's dad, Andy, the first BJJ black belt in the UK, if he thought there was anything special about those men.
I just think the northern pit towns, maybe it's bred into northern people to work harder, or northern people are tougher because it's in the genes. They must have had a really strong sense of wanting to achieve what they're wanting to achieve and some kind of legacy.
And none of this wrestling was being done on mats. It was all done in fields for a fiver or even down the pub.
The miners that started it, that worked in the pits, they were naturally fit men through the work they did. They used to gather Sunday afternoons in the summertime and go down in the fields and wrestle each other for small wages.
It was then in 1940 that Billy Riley opened the doors of the now legendary Snake Pit Gym, where he trained catch wrestlers who would go on to affect generations of martial artists.
Put some gusto in it. See, you should have grabbed that arm like that, put his head on the floor, you understand? Put his leg over here and pull him over here like that.
I also got a chance to speak to a guy called Mark Cocker for this video as well. And this is a guy who competed at the Commonwealth Games and is a multiple-time British wrestling champion and has black belts in several other grappling arts. Better yet, he's from that area of England we're talking about, and he still runs wrestling classes at his gym there in Bolton, which can trace its roots back to the Snake Pit and wrestlers from that era.
And suddenly you realise that there is this real rich, deep history of wrestling and grappling in Britain, but particularly in the Northwest. You cannot be involved in Northwest wrestling without immersing yourself and also understanding the background to kind of catch wrestling and the Snake Pit. Billy Riley is a legend in this area. He kind of built up that Snake Pit gym himself. All these people trained in Wigan and kind of learned from Billy. and then went on to a kind of European and international stage, so they achieved notoriety around the world.
And this is where we really start to see the threads of history get sewn, as Billy Riley and his gym can be linked back in so many ways to different parts of combat sports history. Chapter 4, Shaping the Future. Alright, so let's talk first about perhaps the most famous wrestler to train under Billy at the Snake Pit, the Belgian legend Karl Gotch. Now, he was born Karl Stas, but fell in love with the art so much he changed his last name to Gotch after the American legend Frank, and he carried his name into the history books. Karl competed in the 1948 Summer Olympics in what was now called freestyle. It was after that he would travel to the Snake Pit and join Billy Riley. But as he was starting to compete, it was also the time period where pro wrestling started to overshadow the competitive nature of catch wrestling. So this guy, Karl Gotch, he was a phenomenal catch wrestler, but he kind of sucked as a professional one because he refused to embrace the gimmicks pro wrestling was now becoming known for. His technical ability was miles above everybody else's, and it wasn't until a backstage brawl with the NWA World Champion, the original Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, that he got blacklisted from the sport.
I don't want to use the word dirty, but would you say you are more rough than scientific, or more scientific than rough, or a good combination of both? I would say scientifically rough.
Gotch, I think, basically beat the piss out of him backstage, and after that he had no choice but to leave the US and the world of pro wrestling. But it just so happened that Japanese wrestling legend Antonio Inoki picked up the phone.
The road from Japan to Wigan is a long one, but it is one well travelled by Japanese wrestlers and fans. For the Japanese, Wigan, and Billy Riley's gym in particular, are the spiritual home of wrestling.
The name Antonio Inoki you may have heard of several times, not just because of his fight with Muhammad Ali, but because of the influence he had on pro wrestling and mixed martial arts in Japan. Now, catch wrestling had actually already reached the shores of Japan through an incredibly important series of events that will make more sense to break down later. But the point is, Japan had been bitten by the catch wrestling bug as well. Inoki was looking for credible opponents, but also a trainer for his new wave of Japanese wrestlers. Now, he'd seen Karl in Japan previously in the 60s and was so impressed that when they wrestled together, he chose to begin adopting Gotch's new catch wrestling techniques.
There is one man who is worthy of the belt. It's Inoki, Yamato Damashi.
And then Karl Gotch remained in Japan, where he began to teach Japanese pro wrestlers his revolutionary new techniques.
Under a punishing daily schedule set up by Karl Gotch, who is often referred to as the god of professional wrestling and who was Inoki's mentor,
passing on all the knowledge he learned from Billy Riley and the Snake Pit. It's even been said that it was these concepts that led Inoki to want to challenge Ali in the first place. It's just a shame he couldn't use any of it, as the rules were heavily restricted in that fight. Now, Karl Gotch's days as a wrestler were winding down, and so he focused solely on training others, including some incredibly important students: Sayama, Maeda, Suzuki, Funaki, and Takada. Now, if you're not up to date with your Japanese MMA history, they might just sound like a bunch of names to you, but they all went on to change the sport forever. Sayama, otherwise known as Tiger Mask, would be responsible for starting Shuto, an MMA organization that began 8 years before the UFC. Maeda would found the promotion Rings, and then of course Funaki and Suzuki would found Pancrase, which was the bigger of all three, and birthed future stars like Ken and Frank Shamrock, Bas Rutten, Maurice Smith, and many more. And all of this was before the first UFC. And eventually Takada would go on to establish one of the greatest MMA promotions of all time, Pride Fighting Championships. And I don't even need to talk or list all the magic that happened in that organization, what legends it helped build.
You actually go back and look at it, you look at some of these big things, Olympic wrestling, Pancrase, all influenced by Catcher's Catch Can. There is a rich kind of lineage and history to all these big kind of multi-million, billion-dollar sports that we have now that goes right back to those people that were coming up from the mines on the lunch breaks.
But Karl Gotch is just one man. What about someone else who came from the Snake Pit that trained MMA fighters? Let's talk about Billy Robinson.
Billy Robinson is a fanatic wrestler. He's a fanatic wrestler and trainer. He trains and he lives and dies training and wrestling. He reminds me of the old-time gunfighters that if they heard there was somebody quick on the draw, they had to go to that town and find out.
Finish it off now, man. I'm not going to go on my back. Finish it off. Come on. Fight, you bloody... Come on!
Like Billy Riley, Billy Robinson was also from Lancashire. At 14 years old, young Billy Robinson started training with Billy Riley and then trained in the snake pit for over 8 years. After winning both British and European championships in legitimate catch wrestling, he turned, like many of the era, towards pro wrestling to make a living. But just like Gotch, he was far more interested in using the realistic maneuvers he'd learned at the snake pit. And so this naturally meant he found himself in Japan to continue down this path of Japanese pro wrestling. After competing in several world championship matches there, Billy went up against the legend Inoki in Japan in 1975. This was after Inoki had already been training with Karl Gotch, and this was essentially a clash of two snake pit catch wrestlers. Now, their coming together led to the creation of the Universal Wrestling Federation in Japan, the first promotion to emphasize legitimate techniques and realism. Yeah, I mean, these guys tried really quite unnecessarily hard to make you think that these fights were real. You know, there's a fine line between 50% and an oopsie.
But he caught me and he knocked me completely out. His heel caught me right here. Down I went, 1, 2, 3. That I don't remember. When I finally come back, I still laying flat. I looked up and there he was getting his hand raised, but I was knocked silly.
While the original UWF didn't last long, it would go through several iterations, including leading directly to Pride. Its latest name change is Catchers Catch Can Snake Pit Japan, so I think that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about its connections to Karl Gotch and Billy Robinson. So this was really the origin point of every other Japanese MMA organization you could name. But what was Billy Robinson up to this whole time? He was training a generation of future MMA fighters. Chapter 5, MMA Roots. Among the students coached by Billy Robinson in Japan was a future UFC heavyweight champion and one of MMA's biggest catch wrestling proponents, Josh Barnett.
Just step around this way. Keep going, they will hold that in.
You're a direct lineage from Antonio Inoki, Billy Robinson, Karl Gotch.
And I really understood what catch was as I started training under Matt Hume, and then training under Billy Robinson and understanding what the lineage elements was. I come from that Japanese pro wrestling side for a guy who's mentored under Billy Robinson and Inoki and gotten to train some under Gotch, and then having his two of his biggest trainers, Matt Hume and Eric Paulson, all under that Gotch lineage as well. For me, it's let's carry the torch. Let's keep the fire lit.
But what about guys like Matt Hume that Josh mentioned there, who also have a direct lineage to the Snake Pit gym? Hume trained in Japanese pancration with the guys who learned it from the Snake Pit, and as well as going on to compete in pancrase himself, he was then brought in as a coach to help run a top pancration gym in the US.
Haru Shimonishi was the actual founder of AMC Kickboxing, and that was in the late 80s in Edmonds, Washington. He came here and opened up in 1991 and brought me in, and then it became AMC Kickboxing in pancration.
And multiple champions would walk out of its doors. Maurice Smith, Jens Pulver, Rich Franklin, of course Josh Barnett, but also Demetrius Johnson, Bibiano Fernandez, the longtime 1FC champion, Hayato Sakurai, the Shuto middleweight champion, Chris Lieben, Matt Brown, and who knows how many other guys that have come through the gym's doors in the 33 years it's been running. Another catch wrestling legend who spent time at the Snake Pit is an American by the name Lou Thesz. Thesz doesn't really get a lot of the credit he deserves either, as he goes on to train Judo Gene LeBell along with Carl Gotch and another legendary figure we've not even mentioned yet, Ed Strangler Lewis. All of them were catch wrestlers, and Judo Gene LeBell had started training with them from the age of 7.
Judo Gene LeBell was one of the great hookers, one of the great fighters in catch wrestling.
What a lovely man. I mean, what a man full of capability of violence and destruction. If he can show holds on you that just makes you feel like your bones are going to explode.
So even though he's known as Judo Gene, his first martial art was catch wrestling. And he would of course go on to work with the likes of Ronda Rousey.
I'm nothing more than her uncle.
Movie stars, a hell of a lot of stuff. You also had other judo guys who had trained under Judo Gene, guys like Gokor Chevichin. He would go on to open the Yaston MMA Academy, which produced a whole load of MMA talent.
Gene LeBell, my coach in this country, that he does catch wrestling.
Now both those guys trained extensively in judo and had a strong background in that as well, that they blended with catch wrestling. But Gene and Gokor would go on to train guys like Neil Melanson. Now Neil goes on to be the head grappling coach at Extreme Couture and then the Black Zillions and Alliance MMA. He'd also work alongside none other than Randy Couture to try and bring back catch wrestling recognition into MMA.
I was fortunate enough to get the chance to work with Billy Robinson a little bit with one of my mentors and training partners, Neil Melanson.
Now, Billy Robinson also got his hands on another guy named Eric Paulson. Paulson you may have also heard of, as he was one of the US's first early pioneers of mixed martial arts.
The man has more grappling experience than I have experience tying my shoes. He became the first American to win the World Light Heavyweight Shudo title in Japan. Now, after this, he became essentially the pioneer in America for leg locks, which run rampant through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu right now.
Eric had spent a lot of time training with Judo Gene already, but also the Gracies back in the late 1980s when they were still teaching out of their garage. After that though, Eric discovered Billy Robinson and catch wrestling, and he fell in love and dedicated himself to the style and its teachings. Then he went on to be the first American to win the Shuto World Championship.
For the last month, I've been training my butt off. I've been very tired because I haven't been sleeping at night. I've been a little nervous.
Greco-Roman wrestling, catch wrestling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo. If there's a way to grapple a man, Eric Paulson's done it.
I'm making beats over here.
And it was kind of weird because catch wrestling was so under the radar and everyone was doing jiu-jitsu at the time.
Now, there's more to unravel about the story of Eric Paulson and how he links the worlds of catch and BJJ together, and we'll get to that in a minute. But suffice to say, Eric went on to teach many MMA talents his skills. Just a few popular names like Brock Lesnar, Cub Swanson, Renato Sobral, Sean Shirk, Ken Shamrock, and so many more. Now, we've talked about the Japanese promotions that formed out of the teachings of the Snake Pit and some of the stars as well, and superstars don't come much bigger in Japan than Kazushi Sakuraba.
You know, one of my favorite fighters ever, Kazushi Sakuraba.
There was something so special about him.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was. And look, I love the Gracies, and he was beating the Gracies, and we couldn't help but like him.
You know, Sakuraba made pride. So a lot of people, they always try to rebuild, make a new organization in Japan now. I say it won't happen. Only when you find a guy like Sakuraba.
And the thing that made him more incredible at the time is that he was seemingly doing it with no legit training other than what he picked up on the pro wrestling circuit. But as you know by now, those techniques that those guys were practicing had been honed for over 200 years in the heart of England. And by 15 years old, Sakuraba was obsessed with becoming the best catch wrestler he could be, and he took that skill set to the top of the world, the Gracie Hunter.
Sakuraba has gone through just about every Brazilian that he's faced. It's just a matter of time before he faced one of the famed Gracie family members. He's got it. The referee has stopped the fight.
He's throwing in the towel.
Kazushi Sakuraba has Gracie quit.
Enzo, that right there, the elbow. It's dislocated the elbow.
Sakuraba has proven it. He's the best fighter in the world.
If anybody had doubts before this fight about Kazushi Sakuraba's authenticity of pro wrestling going in good,
no question.
There is no question.
And just when you think there couldn't be any more twists to this tale, there's one final story to tell about just how deep the roots of catcher's catch can go, all the way to Brazil and the birth of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Chapter 6: The Brazilian Connection. I'm guessing most of you watching this video at this point know how mixed martial arts history was written. The Gracies organised UFC 1 to show the world the dominance of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and they did, winning 3 of the first 4 UFCs and going undefeated around the world in other MMA competitions. But if you've looked deeper into the iceberg, you'll know that Jiu-Jitsu was first taught to the Gracies by a judoka named Mitsuya Maeda. He'd travelled the world sharing, demonstrating and honing his techniques before reaching Brazil and teaching multiple students, including the Gracie family. From there, it was Helio who developed the concept of the guard, and from those changes, BJJ was born and has developed from there. Now, it would seem that catcher's catch can and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are 2 completely different lineages of combat sports, but as with most martial arts, things inevitably overlapped and the 2 styles met long before they got to Brazil.
It's almost like each different combat sport is like a different book in this massive library, and all those books, all those sports are concurrently both telling and continuing to write this kind of ongoing and evolving story of combat sports. And each individual book or story, each individual combat sport has both equal value in itself because it's a contributor to that kind of wider ongoing picture. And sometimes those books get lost, don't they? You know, sometimes they become old and dusty. Things like catch wrestling, people, you know, what is catch wrestling? And then every so often someone goes looking for them, kind of digs them out, dusts them off, re-explores them. And they don't just recognize the own inherent value that that individual sport has, but also the influence that sometimes that kind of forgotten lineage has had.
During the turn of the century and the wrestling boom period we talked about earlier, Mitsuya Maeda set off from Japan to travel the world teaching and learning new techniques. And one of the best places to do that was in England on the catch wrestling scene. After Mitsuya had already travelled to America and met their wrestlers, he arrived in London around 1907. There he went about demonstrating his jiu-jitsu and judo techniques at Cambridge University and the Japanese school in Oxford. He then went on to compete though at London's Alhambra Music Hall in an international wrestling tournament in 2 separate weight categories. He was even quoted saying his style was not unlike catcher's catch can, but would beat it. He would though go on to lose that particular tournament in the final against Austrian catch wrestler Henry Ersinger. The point is though, by competing in these catcher's catch can tournaments, Maeda helped develop and hone his own techniques, and I'm sure change some of his own. It wasn't long after Maeda left the UK that he went to Brazil, where he began teaching. The Gracies picked up his martial art, and Helio and others began slowly forming their own version, which became Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, which itself is of course entirely their own. But it's almost impossible to ignore that Maeda had crossed paths and worked alongside all those catch wrestlers before heading to Brazil.
It's all very similar, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a form of wrestling, so it'd be crazy to think that Mr. Maeda didn't affect Carlos Gracie in his perception, technique, and tactics.
Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, the proliferation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and it all owes it to professional wrestling, catcher's catch can.
Now, that's a pretty big statement, even coming from someone like Josh Barnett, but let's talk about someone else who trained and studied with Mitsuya Maeda, a fellow judoka and martial arts legend, Masahiko Kimura. He'd taken those skills to the Japanese pro wrestling ring, where he was undoubtedly also influenced and taught the catch wrestling style. Now, pro wrestling in Japan had existed since the 30s and 40s, as it had done around the rest of the world, and one of its earliest stars was Harold Sakata. The guy had won a silver medal at the Olympics in weightlifting, but ended up turning into a pro wrestler in Japan. You might even recognize him as Oddjob from James Bond. Yeah, that guy. He was taught by a guy called Ben Sherman, who'd spent time in the 1930s on the UK catch wrestling and pro wrestling scene. Harold had studied under him, and he would go on to train a man who changed the face of Japanese wrestling forever, Rikidozan. After the Second World War, he became known as the father of pro wrestling in Japan for essentially resurrecting the sport. So how does this relate back to MMA? Well, it was Rikidozan who hired Maeda's student Kimura to work at his pro wrestling shows. That is where Kimura studied and learnt the catcher's catch can style that everyone was using in the pro wrestling world. More famously though, Kimura himself would go on to fight Helio Gracie in a showdown of BJJ versus Judo.
Kimura finally was able to capture my grandfather in a shoulder lock, which now bears his name, the Kimura.
What in judo is known as an udagarami, in freestyle wrestling a chicken wing, and in catch wrestling a double wrist lock.
This is Mr. Billy Robinson.
This is called an Okimura in New Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. Bull. Anyway, it was done 1,000 years ago in wrestling before Japan ever saw it.
I think the point is, nothing in martial arts is ever as black and white as it seems.
This knowledge that I've got is actually not mine. You know, it's an accumulation of beg, borrowing and stealing of all the cumulative knowledge that's come from all these different great places and people across the world.
You can call it what you want.
Yeah.
You can call it a double wrist lock, you can call it Kimura, you can call it chicken wing, you can call things what you want. It's just your arm doesn't like being moved that way when your shoulder's over there and your neck's stuck, whatever it is.
To end that legendary story, Kimura would go on to wrestle Riki Dozan in a massive spectacle.
そしていよいよ世紀の決戦が始まった。試合に先立ち、リング上で高いコミッショナーの
It was supposed to be a pro wrestling match,
リングの中央に躍り出ました。がっちりと組み合いました。ゆっくりと。ロープの外。
but it turned into a shoot.
今度はこの時一瞬木村力道山の下腹部を蹴りましたので力道山大いに奮撃。俄然リング上は先を追いつ力道山は木村をコーナーに追い詰めて空手の連続死となりました。一人レフェリーは両選手を分けて木村に注意を与えました。力道山は
And it looked like Riki Dozan was trying to kill him.
これによりまして木村完全に闘志をつけ
He spared him no mercy and beat the shit out of him.
Hey, what's up guys? Jason here. Sorry to break the immersion for a moment, but Alex is actually out of town. I've been the one editing this video and just noticed a couple of things that probably needed to be put in here. And the biggest question you're all probably asking is, why did this all happen? There are a lot of theories out there, but it's clear knocking out a legendary judo expert like this gave Riki Dozan a ton of popularity. Take out one of the best fighters in the world and people start to believe you are one of the best fighters in the world. Even though it's obvious Riki Dozan was just attacking him in a one-sided fashion, Kimura didn't even try to fight back, the crowd still bought it. There are a ton of theories out there that Kimura avenged this situation with the suspicious circumstances surrounding Riki Dozan's death a few years later, allegedly at the hands of the Yakuza, but that has all been pretty heavily debated. Either way, this sent the future Japanese pro wrestling scene down this path of exploring real fighting techniques by the time Karl Gotch arrived there, and that's why they were so interested in what Gotch was teaching. They were two catch wrestling paths colliding.
Pivotally though, it was also Riki Dozan who taught Antonio Inoki these techniques before his death and sent the Japanese pro wrestling scene down this path that eventually led to the Snake Pit and Karl Gotch. One final interesting thing to consider brings us back around to a man I mentioned earlier, Eric Paulson, who trained with the Gracies before going to Japan to study under Billy Robinson and learn catch as catch can. Now, not only is he a link between the two martial arts, but he had maintained such a good relationship with the Gracie family that he had put himself forward to compete at UFC 1 instead of Royce. And who knows, if Eric had been chosen and he went on to win UFC 1, perhaps the martial art we're all talking about wouldn't be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but instead catch as catch can wrestling. The truth is though, we saw Royce at UFC 1 go up against Ken Shamrock, who was a Japanese catch wrestler. He trained with the students of Inoki, guys like Suzuki and Funaki, as a catch wrestler. So that's right, that's why what we are saying here is so crazy. All of this stuff I've been telling you about catch wrestling literally led to UFC 1. Without catch wrestling, there is no Ken Shamrock. There is no Royce Gracie. UFC 1 is a meeting of both of these lineages. And on that night, we also saw Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu prevail.
There's the tap. There's the tap. That's got a great choke. It's over. It's over. That was just very important because, like we said,
you look at Gordon Ryan and Gary Tonin, look at their game. There is that crossover. Their game to me is a hybrid jiu-jitsu style with a lot of catch wrestling aspects.
It's all one style, really. It's just catch wrestling. There is no thing as no-gi jiu-jitsu. That's luta libre. Jiu-jitsu is with the gi. I don't care what anybody says, all right?
But there is something magical to this story, that one of the most influential martial arts ever created, Lancashire Catchers Catch Can Wrestling, went on a journey from worldwide fame to now almost complete obscurity. And yet, we have managed to come full circle with the heavyweight champion Tom Aspinall being from the exact same area of England. The same towns from which those miners came up from the darkness to better themselves and the sport they loved.
Yeah, Tom's been a good grappler since he was about 16 or 17. He competed then at that age against men and was submitting men then. But Tom's always been able to see and get submissions in all the combat sports he's done. And if he hadn't done, and if he can, for me, if he couldn't hit somebody hard and be hit, if he couldn't submit somebody quickly and not get submitted, then I wouldn't have carried on doing it with him because he's my son.
It's about passionate coaches who have a kind of collective desire to share knowledge and continuously improve.
At the end of the day, this is how almost all the prolific martial arts came to emerge. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would not have existed without the catch wrestling circuit, and it probably wouldn't have been brought to the shores of Brazil without it. And freestyle wrestling evolved directly out of Catchers Catch Can. Sambo combined all three of these with boxing and judo and has grown much larger in recent years on a worldwide platform. These are all the building blocks of MMA and its most iconic practitioners. Simply put, guys, without Catchers Catch Can, we would not be here today.